By the autumn of 1942, the war in the Pacific had reached a fragile equilibrium. The early shock of Pearl Harbor had faded, but American naval power was still dangerously thin. Aircraft carriers floating airfields in an ocean with no second chances had become the decisive instruments of modern warfare. Lose one, and the balance could tilt for months. On the morning of October 26, American forces knew contact was imminent. Intelligence suggested Japanese carrier aircraft were searching aggressively, probing for a decisive strike. What remained uncertain was timing, and timing in carrier warfare was everything. A few minutes could determine whether defenders met the enemy at altitude or watched helplessly from below. Aboard the carriers, flight crews worked under crushing pressure. Pilots strapped into F4F Wildcats while deck crews cleared the launch paths at a frantic pace. These were not elite aces chosen for heroism. They were trained professionals who understood that their mission was brutally simple: stop the bombers or watch ships burn. The scramble came late. As Wildcats clawed for altitude, reality set in with cold clarity. Below them stretched a massive American task force over 20 ships moving in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft, fuel, and men. From the air, it was a tempting, vulnerable target. Leading one of the fighter sections was Lieutenant Stanley Swede Vejtasa. 5 months earlier, he had been a dive bomber pilot forced into a desperate fight against superior enemy fighters. That encounter had earned him a reputation for calm aggression and an unshakable presence under fire. Now, that same composure would be tested again, this time with far more at stake. As the Wildcats climbed, reports crackled over the radio. Enemy aircraft had been sighted. Distance was closing fast. The altitude gap remained unforgiving. The defensive screen that American doctrine depended upon was already compromised, and everyone in the formation knew it. Then the bombers appeared. Japanese dive bombers emerged from the clouds, disciplined and purposeful, slipping past the struggling interceptors. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ships below, dark bursts clawing at the sky. Bombs fell through smoke and tracer fire, slamming into steel decks with violent finality. Explosions rippled across a carrier's flight deck, sending fire and debris into the air. For the men in the Wildcats, this was the worst moment a fighter pilot could face, watching destruction unfold while knowing there had been no way to stop it in time. Anger replaced shock. Focus replaced despair. The battle was no longer theoretical. If they could not prevent the first strike, they would make certain there was no second chance. The sky above the American task force erupted into chaos. Smoke, flak, and contrails tangled together as aircraft from both sides tore through the thin air at lethal speeds. Below, sailors on USS Hornet watched helplessly as enemy dive bombers completed their runs, bombs slamming into steel with brutal precision. Fire spread across the flight deck, and the illusion of control vanished in seconds. For Lieutenant Stanley Vejtasa, there was no time for disbelief. As the Japanese Aichi Val bombers pulled out of their dives and turned for home, he finally had his opening. Anger sharpened his focus. He rolled his Wildcat into position, closed the distance, and squeezed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber machine guns erupted, tearing into the enemy aircraft. One Val disintegrated in mid-air, spiraling down in flames. There was no pause to count victories. Another wave was already approaching. Vejtasa repositioned and struck again, cutting down a second bomber before it could escape. But even as enemy planes fell, more pressed through. Bombs continued to fall. The Hornet was still under attack, and the cost of arriving late was being paid in fire and blood. Then came the moment no pilot ever forgets. One damaged Val, trailing smoke and flame, did not turn away. Instead, it stayed low and aimed straight at the carrier's island. Anti-aircraft guns hammered it relentlessly, but the aircraft kept coming. Sailors watched in frozen disbelief as the bomber slammed into the ship, detonating in a violent explosion that sent fire racing across the deck. It was not a calculated suicide mission in the later sense. It was chaos, desperation, and momentum colliding in the worst possible way. From above, Vejtasa saw it all. The explosion, the fire, the failure. For a brief instant, there was nothing he could do but watch. Then a new warning crackled over the radio. Another attack was forming. This time, the target was USS Enterprise. Vejtasa did not hesitate. He ordered his squadron to break off and regroup. There was no glory left over the Hornet, only survival ahead. As the Wildcats climbed once more, they regained the altitude they had lacked earlier, converting speed into energy for the fight that mattered most. 4 Val bombers emerged through the clouds, flying straight and confident, unaware of what waited above them. Vejtasa led the descent. The Wildcats burst out of the clouds head-on, guns blazing. One bomber exploded almost instantly as fuel ignited. Another tried to evade, but Vejtasa stayed with it, turning tightly, lining up the shot, and finishing the kill at close range. The remaining bombers scattered in panic, their formation shattered. The sky that moments earlier had belonged to the attackers now belonged to the defenders. But even as burning wreckage fell into the sea, Vejtasa knew the battle was not over. Dive bombers were only part of the threat. Somewhere below, torpedo planes were already lining up their run. The next threat came low and fast. As the smoke from the dive bomber attacks drifted across the fleet, a new warning cut through the radio traffic torpedo bombers. Unlike dive bombers, these aircraft did not announce themselves with screaming dives. They approached just above the waves, steady and patient, built to kill carriers with a single well-placed hit. Lieutenant Stanley Vejtasa rolled his Wildcat over and pushed the nose down hard. Beside him, his wingman, Leroy Tex Harris, followed without hesitation. From altitude, they dove like stones, converting height into speed, racing the clock before the torpedo planes could line up their attack runs. The Japanese formation never saw them coming. At maximum speed, the two fighters tore through the bomber formation, streams of .50 caliber fire ripping into aluminum skins and fuel tanks. One torpedo plane burst into flames almost instantly. Another staggered, lost control, and plunged into the sea. The remaining aircraft scattered in panic, abandoning their carefully planned attack patterns. But the fight demanded more than speed, it demanded judgment. Vejtasa resisted the urge to chase every fleeing target. Ammunition was running low, fuel was being burned at an alarming rate, and experience told him what was coming next. There would always be another wave. The true danger was being caught unprepared when it arrived. He ordered restraint, climb, regain energy, prepare. For a brief moment, the sky seemed almost quiet. Smoke columns marked where aircraft had fallen. Below, sailors on the carriers worked frantically to control fires, treat wounded men, and keep their ships alive. The battle was far from over, but the defenders had bought precious time. Then Vejtasa saw what he had been dreading. A full formation of torpedo bombers was approaching 8 aircraft, intact and disciplined, flying directly toward the American carrier screen. Their target was unmistakable. If even one broke through, the consequences could be catastrophic. Vejtasa pushed his engine to the limit and charged alone into the formation. Anti-aircraft fire from the fleet filled the air with black bursts, tearing gaps through the attackers. But it was not enough. The bombers scattered, each breaking in a different direction, forcing impossible choices. Vejtasa selected one target and stayed with it through evasive turns and clouds. He fired until flames erupted from the bomber's wing, then broke away, searching desperately for the others. His ammunition was nearly gone. His margin for error had vanished. That was when he saw the final attacker. A lone torpedo bomber, damaged but still flying, turned toward the fleet. Vejtasa opened fire with everything he had left. Tracers slammed into the aircraft. Fire engulfed it. Still, it did not fall. His guns clicked empty. There was nothing left to do but watch. The burning aircraft plunged downward and struck USS Smith, exploding in a violent fireball that consumed the destroyer's bow. Flames climbed skyward. Men were thrown across the deck. The shockwave rippled across the water. When the smoke began to clear, the air battle was over. Vejtasa turned for home with an empty gun bay and a heavy silence in his cockpit. He had done everything possible, and still, the cost had been severe. That was the truth of carrier warfare. Victory was not measured by survival alone, but by what it demanded in return. From a strategic standpoint, what happened in the sky that morning mattered far beyond the burning decks and shattered aircraft. In the Pacific War, aircraft carriers were not merely ships, they were the war. Their survival or destruction shaped entire campaigns, dictated momentum, and influenced decisions made thousands of miles away in Washington and Tokyo alike. The fact that USS Enterprise remained operational was no small detail. At that moment in 1942, the United States could not afford to lose another fleet carrier. Industrial power was growing, but replacement ships were still months away from service. Every carrier lost meant fewer planes in the air, fewer pilots in combat, and fewer options for commanders trying to contain Japanese expansion. From the American perspective, the air battle revealed both vulnerability and resilience. The late scramble exposed weaknesses in early warning and coordination problems that could have proven fatal. Yet the response also demonstrated something the U.S. Navy was beginning to master: layered defense. Fighters, ship-based anti-aircraft fire, and disciplined damage control worked together just well enough to prevent catastrophe. The system bent, but it did not break. There were also hard lessons written in fire. Speed of response mattered more than perfect planning. Individual initiative, especially from experienced pilots, could compensate sometimes barely for systemic failure. Stanley Vejtasa's actions were not part of a carefully scripted doctrine. They were improvisation under pressure, executed with technical skill and ruthless clarity. Internationally, the battle underscored a shift already underway. Japanese naval aviation remained deadly, but it was no longer unstoppable. Losses in trained air crews were becoming irreplaceable. Each failed attack represented not just a missed opportunity, but a permanent reduction in combat power. For Japan, this attrition would prove far more damaging than the loss of machines. In the United States, stories of the battle filtered home slowly, stripped of chaos and fear, condensed into quiet reports of ships damaged but afloat. There was no triumphalism, only relief. Relief that the line had held, relief that the war, for one more day, had not turned irrevocably against them. And beneath that relief lay an unspoken understanding. Next time, the margin might be even thinner. When Lieutenant Stanley Vejtasa brought his Wildcat back toward the carrier, his guns were empty and his body was running on exhaustion alone. The sky above the fleet had quieted, but the silence carried weight. Fires still burned, damaged crews still worked. Men were still being pulled from smoke and twisted steel. That day, Vejtasa became what history would later call an ace in a day. By any numerical measure, it was an extraordinary achievement. But numbers alone fail to capture what truly mattered. His victories were not about personal glory or tally marks on a fuselage. They were about time, minutes stolen from the enemy, seconds bought for ships struggling to survive, and narrow margins that kept disaster from becoming irreversible. The USS Enterprise remained afloat and operational. That single fact echoed far beyond the horizon. In the months that followed, the ship would continue to fight, carrying American air power deeper into the Pacific. Its survival was not guaranteed by strategy alone, but by individuals who refused to yield when systems faltered and plans unraveled. Vejtasa survived the war. He continued his service, building a long and distinguished career in the United States Navy. Yet, like many who lived through such moments, his legacy is defined less by what he achieved afterward and more by what he carried with him. Combat leaves no one untouched. The memory of burning aircraft, falling comrades, and decisions made in fractions of a second never fully fades. This is the uncomfortable truth of war. Even its most necessary victories leave scars. Courage can prevent catastrophe, but it cannot erase loss. The flight decks are repaired, the wreckage is cleared, history moves forward. But the cost is always paid by people, not machines. The events of that October morning remind us that modern warfare is often decided not by sweeping maneuvers, but by isolated moments where preparation, experience, and resolve collide. In those moments, the difference between survival and annihilation can rest on one pilot, one decision, one final burst of fire. And that raises a question worth asking. When the margin is that thin, what lessons should we carry forward, so that the next generation never has to pay the same price?